Greetings, and welcome to the 80 Level Roundtable podcast. In each episode, host Kirill Tokarev invites video game industry leaders to talk about the world of game development. No topic is off limits as long as it relates to video game development. New episodes are in the works, so remember to follow us or subscribe and share with someone you know will also enjoy the podcast.
Let's start, right? First of all, thank you so much for joining us and doing this little podcast. And let's start with a little intro so you can tell a little bit about yourself and about your company and how you kind of got into this area of prototyping and why prototyping and so on.
Yeah, sounds good. And first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's an honor as always. So you say first how I got into introduction. Basically, my name is Bernard François. I run a company called PreviewLabs. I started it back in 2010, so a bit over 11 years ago. And we focus specifically on rapid prototyping using game technology as a service for other people. So it's kind of like externalizing rapid prototyping. I kind of started it out of passion, like working in the games industry. I noticed while I was working on projects between maybe 6 and 9 months or even a bit more in duration, and I really noticed as a programmer and game designer that I really enjoyed the beginning because there's a lot of interesting challenges about there's creative challenges in terms of how is this game going to work? What is the actual gameplay going to be? Is this gameplay going to be good? Maybe it has to be tweaked a bit to kind of really find the fun and find the right gameplay. And at the same time, there's like interesting technical challenges, like maybe an interesting technical system that needs to be developed. Like there was this one game where we did like an infinite water surface that was supposed to be moving up and down and you can go onto it with a little boat, and that needed to run on the Nintendo Wii, which has I guess less resources than one of the first iPhone models. So that was so you have these really interesting technical challenges and creative challenges, and it's like I don't know, like it's like you can have more of an impact in the beginning. Like the things you do at the beginning of a project have a bigger impact on the end result, and I thought that was a really exciting space to be in as compared to like more like implementing all the features and bug fixing and getting it really stable, which is of course very important. But yeah, that's what I liked. I was also doing game jams at the same time, and the game jams really motivated me. I thought, what would I be able to do to make like every day to be like a game jam? That's kind of how I got started with the idea of starting PreviewLabs, how I got into prototyping specifically.
So I have a question. So when you're prototyping is something that every company in the video game industry does, right? Even on early
or
stages,
supposed to.
they kind of all do this, and prototyping happens in a variety of different ways, and it's not entirely because when people are talking about prototyping, mostly they think about like gray boxes and default characters running around them or something like that. But it can also happen on paper. It can also happen on, wherever, right? Sometimes people just contemplate and think about it and so on. So when you have clients coming to you, what is your recommendation? Like, what do you need to have, like, in your head or on paper, on somewhere, in order to start actually building the prototype? Because I think having an idea is not really enough to do like a prototype, and there is like a lot of space for interpretation. So how do you kind of narrow it down to make sure that you do exactly what the clients want?
Yes, very good question. I do agree. Just an idea or a vague idea is not enough to immediately start prototyping. You don't want to just rush into it. Like I mean, prototyping, it's obviously a way to learn something without going all the way. And the same applies to prototyping. You don't want to go all the way and develop a prototype before maybe you can learn something on a smaller scale, on an even smaller scale. So it's kind of like you start with very simple tools. The most simple tool, just your imagination. Yeah, thinking about possible ideas, coming up with ideas, kind of seeing which one make you feel excited and less excited, and that's a very cheap tool. That's just thinking and imagining. And on the very opposite side, you have developing the whole game. And so prototyping is something closer to maybe thinking about it, but you kind of, you try it out, and before you actually program a prototype, there's other things you mentioned, such as rapid prototype, such as paper prototyping, and maybe gray boxing, and then maybe doing a bit more extensive prototyping work, and then until you end up really developing the game.
Right.
I would say
So
what you need to have, other than just an idea. I think it is good to think about it and imagine the game the way you think it would be on the market, even though it's not there yet. But you can use your imagination to think about what would this game look like in its entirety, almost like at least some kind of vision. You don't have to speculate too far, but just an idea of what it would look like and why would people play it. And that's really important, because once you have this idea of the game, that kind of like a model of the game virtually in your head, you can think about it and see, like, why would people play this? What would be the real draw compared to other games, compared to competitors? You can really think about it and basically, like, for example, thinking about some of the unique selling points. What are the 2 or 3 reasons why people would play this, and then getting a better vision, and then actually from there narrowing down the scope, because prototyping is all about reducing the scope to something smaller, but you first have to get at least an imagined view of what the entire scope could be like, and then before you then narrow it down and identify some things that are important for prototyping.
So what the process that you're describing, it seems like it's very creative. There's a lot of unknowns, and I'm wondering, how do you kind of work with companies to make sure that and discuss deliverability, right? So what does it mean when the prototype is delivered, right? So what do the clients have in their minds, and how do they say, well, this is done and this is not done, and we would like to go with this, or we don't want to go with this? Do they do some tests of the prototypes? Do we just agree that the prototype performs certain functions, or is there something else? Because it seems like there's a lot of room for interpretation, and people, especially when they're like outsourcing this stuff, they need to understand like what they're gonna get. So how do you communicate that with the client?
Yeah, so basically, as you can imagine, it's an iterative approach. So you take it step by step. It's not like we discuss the game idea with the client, and then we just make all the decisions on our own and give them a prototype and say, this is it. And based on that, you now have to make a decision. So it's really more like this iterative approach. It's like a tiered approach where you start simple and then you adjust it. And so it's really like a collaboration. It's not like they're sitting next to our developer working on it, and that's not productive. But it's an iterative approach where we start really simple. We start usually with the core gameplay mechanics, or maybe some of the core gameplay mechanics, not even all of it. It depends a bit. Sometimes it's a specific system that makes the game unique. That's where we get back to the unique selling points. And then maybe some of the other mechanics that kind of support the gameplay, so you can just try it out. And then you iterate, like you take it simple in the beginning, and then you look at it, because at any step you could cancel the project if you wanted to, if you feel that, okay, based on the very core, like what is the most important assumption, and you put that in a prototype, and then you see, okay, no, this doesn't work, then you don't need to continue with the project. Like, even better is to try a few different ideas, kind of different concepts or different variations, and do like a first quick prototype. And in order to compare them, you don't need to go too far. You can actually limit how far you go to the bare minimum, and use the same minimum for a few different ideas, because with that you can often already get a good idea of the potential. If like the very bare bones version of it is already fun, then you really know, yeah, you're like onto something really interesting. And sometimes it takes looking at in this way at the few different concepts, and of course then you go further and you can go deeper, but you should be considered to be able to kind of cancel the project. And of course user testing is crucial. It's not a service we as a company specialize in. We specialize in just the prototyping, and we have draw the lessons from the results of user testing, but it's definitely important. Like, just have start with small groups of users, have them play it, learn about this, and then maybe some of the findings or things you learned, you take it to the other to more people and see what they think, and then based on that you can also use that in your iterative process. As you're iterating, you can take it to the users. Maybe one important thing there is not to do it too early, unless you have multiple concepts that you can compare. But you have to also feel that you gave it your best shot, that you feel, if you see the prototype and you play it for the first time, that you don't feel that, okay, there's these obvious problems in the gameplay, because then you're just wasting your time with user testing. People are just going to call out the very obvious things. It needs to feel like, okay, this could be really a good game. And then let your users tell you maybe it's not. You're too excited, and then you learn something.
This is actually an interesting question. So when in games there is this idea that not an idea. There's this term for vertical slice, right? So vertical slice is basically the game as it should be, but it's like a very short little piece of it, right? So you would say you create the character, you create the environment, you create the mechanics, and you play it for like a minute or like a minute and a half or something. And that's basically your game. So when you're doing a prototype, is it important to have like all the elements there, like you mentioned, to have the graphics and all the stuff, or you could actually leave it with like some gray boxes and some default characters, but the gameplay should be there? I mean, coming from game jams, you probably know that in majority of cases, it's enough to have a very interesting mechanic, and people really get kind of engrossed and interested even without the visuals. So for your prototyping, do you bother about like the looks, or do you mostly work on mechanics and try and figure out how to make it, the best?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So when it comes to vertical slices, they tend to be pretty expensive, because you're pretty much doing a lot already. Like, you're getting basically all the features in, and you want to kind of represent the final gameplay at the final quality level and everything, but even for a few minutes. However, that still takes a lot of features to be implemented, and of course it depends a bit on the type of game. If it's like a narrative game and like a story game with a lot of animations and long story and everything, then maybe vertical slice may not be all that bad, because it kind of shows. I mean, because the cost of that slice is still going to be low compared to the whole thing. But if we're talking about a gameplay that heavily depends on gameplay mechanics, and for example, a complicated set of gameplay mechanics, probably the most expensive vertical slice that I can think of would be like a MOBA or something. Like, you need so many different features and so many different things, especially if you want to make it all to the final level. So yes, there's definitely referring to game jams. Like, if you can make something that's playable in 48 hours, that's basically the idea here as well. Like I'm not saying that the graphics need to be bad. I think we do pay attention to the graphics, but specifically to have the graphics in a specific way, which means for a prototype, what is really good, in my opinion, is is what I would call it functional graphics or stylized graphics. So instead of aspiring to obtain the final quality of the graphics, I would just go for something that just represents the gameplay and is there to communicate important cues from the gameplay to the user, but not ugly and also not super pretty. Like basically, if the goal is to really understand whether the gameplay is good, because that's what prototypes are really the best at. Kind of, it gives you the opportunity to play it and to feel the gameplay. If you just show really beautiful graphics, yes, beautiful graphics can elicit emotions and it can make you feel really good and wow, and you can be in awe just because of the graphics. And that would be bad in a prototype when the idea is to judge a concept. You don't want to. It's like throwing sand in the eyes of the player, and they kind of get. I mean, or maybe I don't know, a fairy dust or whatever, something more positive. But people would get, they would think it's a good game because of the graphics. At the same time, the opposite, I believe, is also possible. If something looks really horrible, that you get a bad feeling from it. So that's why I'm saying stylized. So functional in order to get for the functionality of the gameplay, to communicate clearly what is going on in the game. That is important, very important, to understand the gameplay and to get the feeling of the game. And stylized to have the right level where you can, it's almost like it's transparent, like you see right through the graphics and you see the gameplay. That's what I believe is really important. And it's also, of course, an important tool when you're prototyping. The idea is to spend a slice of your budget and use that small amount of your budget compared to the full cost of development, especially if you're going to cancel or you don't know what's going to happen in prototyping, and you may need more prototypes to really figure out the gameplay. So you want to keep it as cheap as possible. Also, with this whole iterative approach, if you go too far and put a lot of effort in the graphics and then you iterate, you have to change it. Then, as soon as you choose a certain level for the graphics, you need to be consistent with that. And if you're iterating, that means always making sure you keep that level there. And if the graphics are more simple, this is just easier. So when people say like, hey, but we do need fancy graphics to show it to an investor, then or for some reason or presentation or whatever, like this is something you can do in the end if you really feel you have to. I mean, there's ways to avoid it. You can present graphics outside of the game. You can use a prototype to show the gameplay. You can have I don't know, a demo reel or something that presents maybe even existing artwork from the people you're working with. But you definitely if you do integrate any more fancy graphics, you want to focus that on in the very end.
So I have a question. So you if you go on your website, there is a lot of different companies there. There are not just games, right? There are companies who are working, there are like institutions, educational establishments, there are a bunch of different clients from different areas. And yet all of them you are using game tech to work with and to build prototypes. So my question is, what are the advantages of game tech? And if you can specify what game tech you're using, it would be great. What are the advantages of this technology? Why do you use it? And how can it benefit like other industries outside of games?
Yeah, so first of all, of course, the people we work with, the reason why they all use game technology is, of course, because of our specialty that we do prototyping with game technology. We wouldn't be helping people that need a prototype built, like, I don't know, for a website or for any other application that doesn't use real-time rendering. But it's true, like we see a lot of applications where different areas where it gets applied. So definitely, I think what makes game technology is really, I think the way, I mean, as a programmer, like it's like, okay, you have a frame-based system where you have like almost, if you compare it to a theater, like you arrange the scene behind the curtain and then the curtain goes open and then it closes again and you rearrange things and it opens again, and that happens 30 or 60 or even 90 times per second, and that's kind of a pretty interesting way of programming. That's kind of different, so that makes it something you can specialize in, and that also allows you to create something that's very visual and at the same time very responsive, so you can react, and so that makes it kind of like good for things that are, I don't know, maybe simulation like a lot of, if you think about different games, GTA, it's like a simulation of a city, or any racing game, you're racing and it's kind of a simulation of a car, or even a platformer game, it's a simulation of somebody walking and jumping and shooting and doing everything, and so and maybe in a way you could say, so a simulation is kind of somehow a reproduction of life. So I do think anywhere where you're practicing something, that's kind of like a simulation, right? So if we're talking about training, so we did, for example, a forklift simulator, a prototype in VR. So it gives you really the feeling that you're in a forklift, and you can practice that. And of course, that was that was more visually accurate, and we used graphics supplied to us from our clients to reach that level. But there could also be more specific, kind of like prototyping, like where prototyping takes a specific element or specific elements from a game. In general, game technology can be used to take specific elements from real life and turn it kind of into a simulation that you can learn something from. It could be like, for example, it could be a game, maybe where teenagers learn about alcohol use, and that they should be careful not to drink too much, for example, and that could be kind of a game with social environment in it, and it could be it could be simple, like a party game or something, but it actually takes real things from real life, and it kind of recreates a simulation. And I know, as gamers, we know, like, like when you play a game, those memories of playing a game, it's like a real life memory, so it can really give a very deep impression. And I think those are among some of the reasons why I believe game technology is really awesome. It's a way to experience something because it's visual and it's like interactive, like it's real-time interaction, and that makes you feel like kind of you're there, or you're part of something, or you have a direct influence on something, and that's something that allows for a lot of learning, memorable experiences. It also allows for something really engaging, like something I didn't mention, and it's not related to game technology, but gameplay itself is an experience where you learn. Like we all know the graph of related to flow, where you want to balance the amount of challenge with the skill of the player, and that way you can learn if it's in balance, if it's not too challenging or too boring. And I think that actually is very powerful in a lot of ways. So if you compare that to maybe I don't know, like a school book or something, which kind of seems kind of boring. Of course, there can be challenge and learning in other ways as well. But I think there's a lot of theory in games that is really interesting, that can be applied in a lot of different areas. And it's not a coincidence that as a company offering rapid prototyping with game technology, that we get exposure to that we work for a lot of these types of clients, because prototyping is really the most fun part of game development. There's a lot of game developers that prefer to do it themselves. Of course, we work for those where that's for some one or another reason not a possibility, or not interesting for them. But it does also expose us to a lot of people outside of the industry that are really looking to apply and learn something regarding how they can use this technology.
Some of the interesting stuff that you've done is, at least that it was very interesting for me to learn, that you were doing prototypes for ads with Activision Blizzard, and I think maybe some other companies. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works? So basically, they're building a game for like interactive banners, right? And then you try to understand how this game's gonna look and the user's gonna interact with it and that stuff. Would be nice to learn more a little bit about that process.
Yeah. So, and this also ties into there's this interesting question that I get asked many times during most meetings, and that is like, what happens after prototyping? Do you just throw it away, or what do you do with it? And in most cases, I'm very clear about this. Like, yes, you throw it away. You don't just throw it away. You actually learn from it. That's the whole thing. Prototyping is typically a learning process, and in most cases, yes, you throw it away. You don't continue with the code that you made, and this is especially true when you see a big game and you kind of make it kind of a lot smaller. You're reducing the scope of a bigger idea to something much smaller, or as small as you can, and then make a prototype, and as you're prototyping, you're iterating, the source code evolves, and at the end, the source code is pretty much ready to be scrapped. And then you start from the learnings that you learned, and you build this foundation for a bigger game, and that's in itself really good. However, when there are some cases where it is acceptable and possible to actually take the code from a prototype and use it. I think one case, which is not related to the question, but one case is where it's a very technical system that you're kind of trying to almost like do a technical proof of concept, figuring out something technically complicated, like a new algorithm, and then you do build a prototype around it to test it out as kind of a test environment. But then you can take that technical algorithm and use it. And in other cases where the difference between functionality of the prototype is actually not very big with the actual application. And that's where we ended up doing some prototyping work with Activision Blizzard Media that needed these little kind of interstitial games. And the idea was to have different formats that can be adapted to different brands. And basically what we did is we kind of prototyped these different formats that can be adapted for those advertisement games. So really short games that you play in between other sessions of a main game.
Funny that you need to make another game in order to engage player to continue playing. That's just...
Well, no, it was really for advertisement. It was instead of just serving ads, to serve like playable ads. So it's not like yeah, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So let's talk more a little bit about your team, right? So one of the things that you're doing is that you're doing rapid prototyping, right? So it means that you are building these iterations very quickly. So how big of a team do you need to have to build these things fast and to make sure that you learn, you iterate, and you go forward, and you always have some kind of like experiment going on? Because I think in other studios, and like especially in smaller studios, people usually don't have this luxury. They don't have the team, and they don't have the time to really think about the prototyping and so on. So in many cases, they just kind of go with whatever they think will work, and there is a lot of bad things that can happen after when you release the game. So how big of a team do you need to have to kind of start playing around more with prototyping?
Yeah, I would actually say it can be really small. Like what we do when we prototype, I mean, of course, it's slightly different if it's prototyping for other people, and because there's maybe some extra communication and there's some unique differences. However, I'm not even sure if that's the case. Like, because if you prototype internally for yourself within a company, you still need the programmer who's going to program the prototype to understand what it's about, and you do need a process, especially if you're going to do that on a recurring basis and kind of systematically be prototyping. You need some way to set it up and to kind of properly communicate and everything. But in terms of what we do, like typically, I would say it's only one full-time programmer, and sometimes two, maybe three, but for larger prototypes. But for a lot of things, the key in eliminating a lot of overhead is just having only one programmer. Like we, as a rule of thumb, we say If you have one programmer and then you scale it to 2, you basically double the budget or the costs, but you only gain maybe 50% more, because as soon as you have a second programmer, that requires programmers to communicate with each other. Actually, the lowest amount of overhead you can do is if you're the person that comes up with the idea and you can program it yourself. Then you don't even need to tell anybody what to do. And then that's the ultimate way to cut out overhead, but that's not a very scalable one, because then you would keep let's say you have game designers coming up with very creative ideas in the company, you would keep them occupied long term on programming and not being productive as in generating a lot of ideas, as in doing what they're good at. But so it doesn't take a large team. You can, like for us, it's like one programmer and then maybe a quarter of the time of that programmer worth of project management in terms of figuring out the scope, testing it, kind of going back and forth. It is good to have a bit of a team, a programmer by themselves. Sometimes you need somebody else to kind of test and tell you like, hey, this doesn't actually properly work, or this I don't understand what's going on, while the programmer will know because I made it what is going on. And so you'd always need somebody external, and even better, of course, as I mentioned, like other potential players within your audience. But yeah, you can actually do it on a pretty small scale. Just don't make it too complicated. And if you do it internally, and then you have to be careful that the source code is not just blindly reused, because people are always very optimistic about that we can do this, we can take the source code of the prototype, even though we change the features 5 times and there's no structure left. We can take this and build it out. Usually the answer is no, don't do it. And I've seen other companies that did it really well, where when I started, actually, I started back in 2010, but I started my career in 2007, and I did some internship where we did some work with a company in the Netherlands, Zynga, which was then acquired by Real Games, so in the casual game space. And they had a really good process, actually, where that I saw there, where they had even a different programming language, different people and a different programming language. So they would, I believe, I think it was ActionScript and Flash that they would be prototyping, and then it would be impossible for the programmers that were developing in C++ to actually do anything with it. And that way they really made sure that it's not possible. Do not use any of the dirty hacks and quick techniques and tricks, all the trickery from prototyping. Don't use that in your actual development. So that is a really important thing if you do it internally. And also just keep it simple, keep it small. And one last tip maybe there is, it ties into the iterative nature, but really define your iterations in advance. We call it like a prototype design document. Make a prototype design document where you say, iteration 1, we're going to do these and these and these features, and that's it. And then you make sure you do all of those features. You don't go halfway and then get excited about other ideas and then maybe add more. So you want to make sure you define your experiment in advance and really well. Don't put too much on it, so there's no reason to go only halfway and already make a decision. Then you need to only have half of that in your first iteration. And also don't add any ideas. Just write them down, keep them somewhere, so you can then consider them when you go to the next iteration. But then even better, if you have multiple ideas, don't go to the next iteration. First to the first iteration of other ideas and compare, because it could really be that the second idea that you're going to work on next is actually way better, and you don't know. So that are some tips that I would give. And the nice thing about that is if you're comparing multiple ideas, you can have one person on one idea, another person on another idea, and just make sure if you create those prototype design documents that you make them similar and kind of scope reduction in terms of so they become comparable.
So we kind of skipped this question, but in terms of technology, what would you recommend using if you're doing prototypes? Would you suggest doing Unity or Unreal, or maybe just do it on paper? What is like
Yeah.
a good tool to start
I
using?
mean, like we don't specialize specifically in prototyping on paper, but if it's a concept that can be translated between paper and interactive on the paper, you interact with the paper and where the interaction is pretty much the same on the computer, yes, or other device, yes, totally go for paper prototyping if you can. Of course, don't try to make every game into a paper prototype. Don't make a first-person shooter into a paper prototype. I mean, yes, you can make sketches for the UI or whatever, but we're talking about interaction, like actually moving maybe through an environment or the actual whatever the interaction is. Like I can imagine some 2D physics-based games to work really well as a paper prototype, or maybe it doesn't need to be paper. Maybe it can be an actual vertical plane with gravity in real life. So yes, you can totally think of ways of simulating it. Just don't take any too big steps in terms of translating things that may not be possible directly on paper, because then you risk that any findings you make on paper are no longer transferable to the real world. But then, in terms of technology, I would say, without being mentioning a specific technology first, I would say any technology that you feel really comfortable in, that you can work in really quickly, and also that does not limit what you can do. I think when prototyping, it is important to be able to make decisions based on creativity, based on what works, not based on maybe limitations in your own skill compared to how you can work with that technology. And then that said, I'm definitely a fan of Unity and also Unreal in some cases, but basically, the technology that allows you to build something really fast is definitely the best. And for us, we do have a lot of experience in Unity. So for a lot of projects, we go to Unity. But there's also some projects we did in Unreal where we used blueprints. So it does also depend a bit on the person who's working on the prototype, what needs to be done in the prototype, and which technology makes it easiest to get there. But you definitely don't want to be stuck in a technology where you can only do certain types of games, or where certain changes are too much work, or where it gets really difficult. Like usually, I actually like starting at a lower level in terms of technology, not having too many pre-existing systems, for example, that you then need to modify. You don't want to start with a system at the level of your gameplay, where that it really offers all the features for that gameplay, but then you can't really change it, because then you need to change that system, and that system that could be used to or advertised to create a certain high level gameplay experience. It's always very flexible, and but then if you need to change it in a way that's not possible, then you're kind of stuck. So sometimes just making things more simple, less advanced, and building things from scratch so you can make changes quickly, that is also really important. It's not only about how quickly can I put together something that looks impressive, it's also about how quickly can I iterate. That is really important. So sometimes if you build a little bit more from scratch in the beginning, it can really help you make changes really fast, because you understand everything that you just built. And just don't build too much. Don't take it too far. Keep it simple.
Well, Bernard, I think that was kind of like a very good advice to anyone who's kind of trying to do a prototype, not trying to build too much and trying to get just one thing, one step at a time. Just to start with one simple thing, then start with another simple thing, and kind of build on top of them. Because I guess if you try to add all of those things together, it starts to kind of go out of proportion, and you don't really follow what you actually wanted to test. You don't really know if it's going to work or not. So if anyone in our audience kind of is interested in your services and wants to kind of jump on board, and so where should they go? We will leave the link to your website in the description as well. And probably they can message you or some members of your team, and then you can start the discussion.
Yeah, definitely. They can go to our website at PreviewLabs.com, and then there's a contact form where it actually ends up directly in my mailbox. So, and then some of my colleagues also monitor it. And then if you just want to feel inspired and learn a bit more about the phases of prototyping, I would definitely say maybe browse around a little bit on our blog. If you're more of a visual person and you want to see videos, just go to youtube.com/PreviewLabs. You see some of the past prototypes that we've worked on. We are also working on updating our website a little bit more. We need to add some of our past projects. You've probably seen a big gap from 2021 to like maybe 2017, where it was just too busy. Like we need to update a lot of that. But we've been doing our best to actually share some of the knowledge and the things we've been working on. It can really help inspire people. So definitely go take a look and see. There's some pretty interesting things that we're fortunate enough to be able to work on. So it's I'm really excited to be able to do this.
Cool. Thank you so much, Bernard. Thank you so much for your time. It was very, very interesting. So I will leave the links in the description. Go check out the blog, check out the website, and learn more about prototyping. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kirill. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for enjoying another episode of the 80 Level Roundtable podcast. Check out upcoming episodes on the 80 Level website at 80.lv. Join our career site at 80.lv/RFP. And share our podcast with friends and on your social networks.